So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Christiana Rossetti's poem, The Goblin Market. And in this lecture, we'll conclude the poem, conclude our reading of the poem, and just focus our attention to the final stanza, where the regeneration happens, where Laura comes back to health and normalcy and a healthy lifestyle, and Lizzie, of course, comes back from the Goblin Men, the Goblin Market, carrying the antidote for Laura's degeneration. And we saw how in the previous lecture the symbolic significance of the penny is important, because she walks into the market with a penny, which is a marker of agency, a marker of her authority, a marker of her ability to quantify the commodity. Because if you're paying penny to someone, if you're paying a fee to someone for a commodity, you have the ability to commodify, to quantify the commodity and put a name to it, put a classification to it. So that undercuts the anarchy and the menace of the market, as was embodied by the Goblin Men. And of course, she comes back with the antidote. And in a very Christ-like image, Lizzie walks back with bruises on her body, but these are bruises of healing. And then Laura kisses her and drinks the syrup, the juice from her body, as an antidote to the decadence and degeneration that she had suffered, during her experience with the goblins in the market. Now, the poem ends very interestingly with it cuts into the future in a way, and then we have Laura and Lizzie, who are now wives, who are married and with families, and they tell the episode of the goblins to the younger children, presumably female children. And what's interesting to know is the idea of sisterhood, which is present in the poem throughout. And it's a very complex idea. It's not quite clear whether you're talking about sisterhood as biological kinship, or sisterhood as friendship, or sisterhood as something quasi-erotic in quality. That's never quite spelled out, but what is obviously quite palpable is the intimacy between the two female protagonists over here. And that intimacy is extended onto the future as well, in the sense that they marry and they become wives, but then there's no mention at all about the husbands. And we get to know that they sit with the children and tell them the warning tale of what happened with the Goblin Men, and how one sister stood up for the other sister, and then they rescued each other in a tale of fall and regeneration. So if we take a look at these stanza, where we are told that the stanza, which begins with words with the line days, weeks, months, years, afterwards when both were wives with children of their own, the mother hearts beset with fears, their lives bound up in tender lives, Laura would call the little ones and tell them of her early prime, those pleasant days long gone, of not returning time. So obviously when they become mothers and wives, then they call the children sometimes and tell them stories about their prime, tell them stories about what the events that happened which will not come back, not returning time. Would talk about the haunted glen, the wicked, quaint fruit merchant men, the wicked outsiders, the evil outsiders. Again, the Goblin Men over here, obviously they represent alterity, they represent a sense of otherness, fearful otherness, menace which comes with otherness, etc. The wicked, quaint fruit merchant men, their fruits like honey to the throat, but poison in the blood. Men sell not such in any town. And that sentence has appeared already once in a poem, men sell not such in any town. So it obviously comes from outside, it obviously comes from this degree of fearful foreignness about these Goblin Men, about how they become embodiment of a certain kind of menace which comes from the outside, which doesn't quite have a name. They come from places where things are perversely pleasant, things are perversely abundant, and they come with fruits which are grown in such inorganic, unnatural conditions. And that's a tale of caution, a tale of almost a morality fable, which is told to the young children of Laura and Lizzie subsequently, and how they encounter the Goblin Men, and how one sister fell for the enchantment and the seduction of the Goblin Men, and the other sister, Lizzie, rescued her through great pain and difficulty. And this is what the moral fable is, and this is what the story that is told to the children. Would tell them how her sister stood in deadly peril to do her good, and win the fiery antidote. So the antidote, of course, is a juicy syrup which was smeared all over Liz's body, which she did not consume, but she brought back for her sister to eat of her. And it's almost, there's a cannibalistic quality about that image, if you think about it. Lizzie offers her sister her body, which is very Christ-like. It becomes the healing body, which will then resurrect and regenerate the fallen woman, the decadent, dying sister. And win the fiery antidote, then joining hands to little hands would bid them cling together. For there is no friend like a sister in calm or stormy weather, to cheer one on the tedious way, to fetch one if one goes astray, to lift one if one totters down, to strengthen whilst one stands. So there are certain critics who bring in the lesbian angle into this poem in terms of how the whole idea of sisterhood becomes, a sense of solidarity becomes a community of solidarity, which is quite sexualized in quality. But then what's more important for us to remember is how the binary between the menacing men, or the men who are carriers of menace, the men who are markers of menace, and their sisters or females who stick together in terms of regenerating themselves, in terms of healing themselves, how the binary works out in very interesting ways. So the whole poem, if you go back and reread it, which you should, you find it's a very complex poem, because among many things it does, it is a tale about feminist critique of masculine mercantile behavior, masculine mercantile invasion, and how the feminist critique undercuts to a certain extent the menace of the marketplace, which is a very masculinist menace. It's about fearful men who look very fearful, who come from the outside. There's an outlandish quality about these men and the merchandise. And the outlandish quality obviously defamiliarizes and deterritorializes the known landscape, the known idyllic landscape of this very English countryside. And of course, how the two sisters represent or embody that virgin quality of the landscape to a great extent, and how that is obviously invaded by the merchantmen, and how the merchantmen bring in wares and merchandise and fruits from different parts of the world. And of course, one cannot but notice the colonial imperial subtext to the poem, and how these people come from different parts of the world. So perhaps one reading could be perfectly valid. Perhaps these are men who are non-British men. These are men who come from other parts of the world. They come in. They could be coming from other parts of the English colony. Perhaps they bring in goods and merchandise and fruits from those places, which contaminate the purity and the hygiene of the British moral system, of the English moral system. Now, of course, that reading is quite problematic, because what it assumes and automatically is that the non-British, non-white outsider is evil by default, and the English white virgin ladies who are embodiments of virtue by default. And that binary is quite problematic in quality. But even if you don't subscribe to that reading, it's possible to see how this poem opens up to different kinds of interpretations in terms of the dangers of unregulated consumption, the dangers of unregulated capitalism, and the very male quality about that unregulated capitalism, and how, if you take a look at the different scenes of violence in the poem, which are very sexualized in quality. So for instance, when Lizzie walks in the marketplace and the merchantmen, they try to force feed her, to surround her and force feed her and try to cram food into her mouth, and there's very frequent references to the juice and the syrup with which she's smeared obviously carries a very erotic and gory kind of a sort of illusion, and then of course she emerges out of it victorious, and she gets back her penny. So the penny becomes, and again this is connecting back to one of the first arguments about this poem, which is how the moral economy, the sexual economy, and the financial economy are mapped onto each other in very complex ways in this poem. So this penny, the fact that Lizzie holds on to the penny, the fact that she doesn't let go of the penny and she manages to get the penny back. She flings the penny to the merchantman and then she gets it back because they're unable to force feed her. Getting back the penny becomes a marker of moral security, becomes a marker of sexual preservation, becomes a marker of sexual purity, of moral purity. So the fact that she has a penny, of course, gives her a sense of ownership and agency in the marketplace. But the fact that she refuses to establish any kind of correspondence apart from the penny, she refuses to establish any correspondence with her sexualized self, that becomes a marker of self-preservation, the preservation of her sexuality, with which she undercuts and with which she sort of essentially and symbolically decimates the Goblin Market. And we're told how the Goblin men, they very briskly disappeared along the glens, along the different parts of the landscape. So this poem is a very complex poem because space again becomes a very important symbol in the poem, in the sense that the spatial metaphors, the spatial mappings are very interestingly done. So we have the home space, the idyllic space where there are cows and honey and butter is being churned. That's very idyllic and domestic and familiar, and there's a virtue quotient about that home. And in contrast to that, we have the marketplace, where things come and go, where everything is temporal in quality, where everything can very quickly change into something else. There's no permanence at all. And the lack of permanence, the lack of, the virtue quotient in the marketplace makes it a complete and perfect other of the home. So the market is the other of the home, spatially speaking. And that spatial otherness, it obviously extends onto the physiognomic otherness in terms of how the goblin men look like. They look like, people with whiskers and tails and, nails, and they have cat-like features, they have rat-like features, and they fly in, they hobble in, they crawl in, they roll in. The movement's not very human at all. So again, that becomes part of the uncanny that is created by the marketplace and the men in the marketplace, and how the poem becomes an example how the domestic can be consumed by the uncanny, but then again the domestic can get rid of the uncanny and recover from the uncanny. And in that sense, it becomes a very feminist poem about the necessity to stick together as women against the invasion of dangerous and menacing men. So, and again, there are many other readings you can do with this poem. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it started off, it was first produced as a children's poem, as a bit of a fairy tale for little boys and girls. But then it's interesting to see how it emerged with time, how it took up and assumed more readings with time, in the sense of being a very complex poem about consumption, contamination, sexual deprivation, regeneration, and sisterhood. And sisterhood, of course, is a very, very loaded term, a very complex category of identification of this poem, because, as I mentioned, it could be seen as a sort of a biological kinship, it could be seen as some kind of a sexual kinship, it could be seen as a moral kinship, and perhaps a combination of all in very asymmetric ways. So do read the poem many more times, because I'm sure the more you read it, the more readings will emerge out of it in terms of the different possibilities that a poem offers us, especially if you look at it from a feminist perspective. So it's a very important poem, it's a very important text, not least if you're doing feminist writings as in the world we stand today, because it is one of those poems which take up different readings at different points of time. So one can read as how this idea of unregulated capitalism has a very male face. The idea of unregulated, unprincipled capitalism becomes a masculinist menace, and how that destroys, and it can potentially destroy at least, the idyllic quality of hygiene, cultural hygiene, moral hygiene, sexual hygiene, etc., and how that becomes a problem and a menace that is done away with by the time the poem ends, with various acts of sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and regeneration. So with that, we conclude The Goblin Market by Cristiano Rossetti. I hope you found it interesting, and as I mentioned, do read it many more times, because the more you read it, the more readings will emerge out of it. And we move on to a new text in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.